Hi, guys. Today we're talking about population density a little bit more. We were introduced to it in our vocabulary introduction in 1.0, but now we're going to talk about kind of how does population density affect things. We're going to look at specifically three different areas of the world to kind of see this comparison. We're going to look at Australia, United States, and Japan. So we did this definition earlier in the last week. We said the measure of how many people live in a unit of area found by an average, and it's usually people per square mile. So obviously, if you think about Ohio, we have some areas that are more condensed cities. So they would have a much higher or more densely populated area, like in Cleveland or down Akron or Cincinnati or Columbus. But we also have a lot of rural areas. We have a lot of small towns and Amish country and farmlands and things that would be much more spread out when it came to the population density. So what is a square mile? Let's think about that first. So if you walked out to the football field one day at Copley Fairlawn Middle School, you have to go around that track 4 times to do 1 mile. So kind of think of 4 of those football fields put together to think about the space that you were talking about how many people will be in 1 square mile. So let's say we have about 5 people living in those 4 football fields. That's pretty spread out, right? So if you think about it, we have our one person, totally kind of by themselves in the one area over here. We have an area that's totally uninhabited. We have a little cluster of people that could be living a little more densely populated as well. People could have choices. You don't have to live by a lot of people. You could choose probably an area in that square mile that you could have more space and the ability to kind of spread out, run around, and do whatever you like. So think about how that would feel. Some of you might like kind of the alone time. Some of you are people cravers and you'd want to be around more people. So that kind of demonstration, we're kind of showing what Australia would be like. Australia is a large continent. It's also a country. It is 5.43 people per square mile, okay? And it's a huge area of land. So on average, we're saying about 5 to 6 people live in a square mile. So obviously places like Sydney or Perth are going to be more densely populated. Those are major cities. And then the outback in the central region of Australia is going to be very, very spread out. It's going to have desert-like conditions because in that area. So it's not as much livable land. Sydney, Perth, those are all coastal cities. And those usually are the ones that early developed historically because when the ship came there from another land, that was kind of the first stop. And we're always looking again at the average. So the 5.43 is an average. So obviously Sydney would be much more densely populated than a small town in the outback. I actually took a group of students to Australia when I was in my younger days, and we traveled all the way around the coast and went into the outback. We stayed at a cattle ranch that was over 50,000 acres. It was so large they had to use helicopters to sometimes locate the cattle. And then they would use camels to help graze and keep the area more manicured for the cows as well. And the camels, again, could handle the more desert-like conditions. So pretty wild that they lived that spread out. Their nearest neighbor was not down the street. They were miles and miles away. They would even only go grocery shopping about once a month for kind of pantry items or, things that didn't have to be refrigerated. But then they would have produced a lot of their own milk and meat and resources that they could keep at their own area. They couldn't even go to school. It was too far. They were like the first online learners before it was online. They would actually call in and do like phone conferences because they didn't have substantial internet and Wi-Fi at that time I was there. Population density, again, is an average. So we're looking at Australia, large piece of land, almost 3 million square miles, has a population of over 16 million, mostly flat, lots of livable land, but again, some of it is desert-like, so people don't want to live in those areas. They want these coastal areas like Sydney pictured there at the top. So we have a pretty spread out population density in Australia, and that's all greatly impacted by the size of the land and the different geographical features. All right, now we're in that same space, that same square mile with the 4 football fields, but now we're going to put 68 people in that area of land. So 68, again, you could make choices to spread yourself out away from people. But when you do go in kind of those bigger areas where a lot of people are congregating, it's definitely going to be more compact. So here we're looking at the United States, and I would say like this little outlier over here would be like Montana, but over here might be a New York City or a Chicago. Our population density is 68 people per square mile. We are roughly the same size as Australia, but our population is much, much, much bigger. We have varied land to live in. We can live in the mountains, we can live on a coast, we can live on a farm, we can live in a city. So we have a lot of variation, which makes people want to live here and our, other democratic and economic freedoms. And places like New York City, again, are densely populated. Montana has towns that are even smaller than some of our neighborhoods here in Copley, Fairlawn. I had a friend who lived in Montana for a while. Her town was so small, they only had one stop sign or stoplight area, and they had no speed limits on most of their county roads because it just wasn't enough people to even worry about it. Living conditions differ, though, in the United States, and the cost of living also can vary greatly. So if we think about Australia, they have a lot of space. I talked about being on a huge cattle farm. So they're going to have a lot of resources on their land and not a lot of people that are going to have to worry about kind of importing a lot of things. So Australia is going to have very low cost for things like beef or land to purchase to build a home on. Now, the United States, we vary a little bit. You can go to New York City and you buy a hamburger in New York City and you're going to pay a pretty penny, even if it's a similar restaurant than in Fairlawn, just because of supply and demand. There's more people there, the cost of living's more, the rent's more, all that. So we're going to see a lot of variation in the United States. So you can see we're just about a little over 600 some thousand miles bigger than Australia, but we have a ton more population, you can see from this chart. And we have a lot of livable land. And Australia, that interior area is pretty desolate. And then we have, again, a great variance of our population density. Again, plays heavily into the fact that where our livable land is, where do people want to live? Now, talking of New York City, today is September 11th. So I wanted to bring to our attention, the remembrance of what happened September 11th, 2001. We'll be doing many more activities with understanding this event and why it happened next week. But I didn't want today to go by without talking about, the significance of that. And it ties into what we're seeing here because when the terrorists were planning this attack on the United States, they definitely went for areas that had a lot of condensed people, a lot of people living in close proximity to one another. And New York City, one of the main reasons why it's so densely populated is because it's an economic headquarters for so many businesses and banks and traders and stockbrokers and so forth. So the Twin Towers, which were where the planes crashed into, it was a financial headquarters for so many different businesses. And when these other countries wanted to attack the United States, they felt attacking us at our economic heart would be a successful way to make their point that they did not want U.S. control over their lands, and they wanted to show their hatred for our country. We'll talk again more in depth and get into a lot of the backstory and the events that happened that day and understand it. It is a time today to remember those because we lost so many because they were living or working in this area and were affected. So many people were even distantly affected, a friend, family member, a coworker that unfortunately lost their lives. So again, just all of that condensed people living in one given area. Washington, D.C. was also struck by the planes that day. It's obviously the headquarters for our government. So again, when terrorists were planning these attacks, our economy and our government were definitely a focus to want to destroy as much as they could or affect. And Washington, D.C. is another city that has an extremely high population density. Again, because of the resources of jobs and things that are there with the government. All of our military headquarters are located there. So the Pentagon was attacked, being our military headquarters and all of our higher officials there. There was a third plane that we know was on a mission to do damage. We believe it was headed for the White House to obviously affect our government. But that plane didn't make it to that destination. And we'll get more on those details next week. But there was a group of people on the plane who decided to go against the terrorists. So that's the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania that did not make it into Washington, D.C. So densely populated can affect us in so many ways. If there's a tragedy, if there's a natural disaster, if there is, just our daily life is affected greatly when we change the amount of people we have to deal with and live around in our space. So if we look here at this diagram, I'm showing you our third country. And now we're not just going to have, 60 some or 5 people around us. We're going to be 841 people living in 1 square mile. So, and this is not just one, we're also going to take the amount of space down drastically in this country that we're talking about. It is nowhere near the amount of space in Japan here than in the United States or Australia. Japan is an archipelago, which is a series of small islands. So again, limited space. Then they have mountains and volcanic areas in the middle region of it, or the central area. So literally people live on top of each other. So you think of New York City and those pictures you were seeing, and there were skyscrapers and people ride elevators to get to their work or their apartments. And it's even more drastic in Japan. There's very little livable space. Everyone must live in high rises. They have shared living quarters. Japan hotels, it is not a rundown hotel if you have to share a restroom with the floor. That's kind of a nicer hotel. You cannot, some of their even travel arrangements, you might even share a room with little cubby hole kind of things that you cover up with people you don't know. When you live in an apartment, you probably live with multiple people in your family, multi-generations, because the cost of living is so high. Now, a place like Japan can't produce something like cattle like the US or Australia can, and their farming capabilities are much limited. They have fishing industries and some rice industries on the coastline, but really, their economy has not been successful because of resources of food and natural products like that. Their economy is successful because they do have to trade a ton in, which makes things super expensive. So getting a hamburger in Japan is going to be 5 times what it costs to eat it in New York City in the United States. But their economy is successful because they have all these things to overcome with their small land and their mountain areas and the islands, that they started to create tech industries. So with a tech industry, I don't need a big factory. I don't need a big farm. So they start controlling the technology and the computer sides of it. And then they go and they find areas in other countries to be their factories to produce it. So when I think of Japanese companies, I think of Samsung and Sony and car companies like Honda and Toyota. And those companies, again, they don't actually produce the product on the Japanese soil. They produce the technology and then outsource different areas in the United States or other countries to actually build those items. And so Japan has used their intellect and their technology to really be successful. So why would people choose to live on top of each other in such a condensed city? And it's really the economy, it's jobs, and sometimes tradition with your families. So we see that people are willing to have that kind of condensed living, but definitely a different way of life. Population density increases your prices for homes and products. If you went to look at the average price of a house in the United States, it's about $100,000. So that's pretty low, actually. And one statistic, I'm sorry, Australia is $100,000. That's pretty low. Okay, so obviously they have high population density areas that would be much more expensive, and even areas where it'd be much cheaper. So 100,000, that in around here in Fairlawn area, that would get you a smaller home, maybe 2, 3 bedrooms, maybe a condo. That would be about what we spend around here. Now, in the United States, our average home price is around $250,000. And again, that's an average. We have millions-dollar mansions to, smaller areas as well. And our median house price around 250 would be probably about a good house around here in Copley Fairlawn as well. Maybe now we're going to have maybe an acre, a little more land. We're going to have maybe 4 bedrooms, maybe some nicer features in the home, and so forth for $250,000. Now so median house price in Australia, 100. Median house price in the United States, about 250. We go to Japan, the median house price is going to be 900,000 to 1 million. And that's not getting you a house like you would in Fairlawn or in Australia. That's going to get you an apartment. It's probably going to be studio, meaning no separate bedroom, maybe 1 bedroom. And this is going to be, again, an average apartment. 1 million is not some luxury penthouse. You have to spend $10 million to get something like that. So it's definitely, again, because we don't have the resources. That geography has impacted things, so we have higher prices. Even things like that hamburger I was talking about. We're going to spend about, $2 on a hamburger in Australia. We're going to spend maybe $3 to $5 in the United States, depending which city you're in. And when we're in Japan, we're going to spend more like $20 to $30 for a hamburger. And we're not talking a gourmet here. We're talking your standard, fast food restaurant. So definitely those things increase. Also, your manners and your common courtesy have to be better. Because if I'm in Japan, I'm sharing living space, I'm sharing restrooms, I'm sharing elevators, I'm sharing street areas to walk in and parks. So all those different things, you have to just be more conscious. You can't walk around, touching people or running into people. You have to be very conscious of your behavior and just being more polite if you have to deal with that many people around you. Geography always, again, impacts everything. So yes, it's important to know where the continents and the oceans are. And yes, it's important to know where different water features are. But really to understand how that country has to live their lives daily and historically different because of what their geography has to offer them or doesn't have to offer them. So it impacts how we live and everywhere around there. So we see that more densely populated areas are always going to have higher costs of living, higher costs for homes and products, and are going to make things a little bit more complicated to live. But people are encouraged to live there because so much economic opportunities are there in the job markets. All right, so hope you did well answering the questions along the way in our Edpuzzle lecture today, and we will talk more about population density and 9/11 into next week.